We are all feeling the effects of the pandemic, but young people might be struggling more than we know. And young people who are part of the LGBT plus community might be having an especially tough time. For this week's Mental Health Monday, our Sydney Stallworth spoke with a therapist who tells us she has noticed some changes in her clients over the past few months.
Thinking about suicide as well as planning, contemplating, or attempting has increased across the board for the general population. And then when we talk about LGBTQ youth who are already at an exponentially higher risk for suicidality, to see that increase even more is really scary.
Dr. Sarah Mulder is a licensed clinical psychologist who practices privately, but she's with the Longwood Psychology Center in Huntsville.
I would say probably about 75 to 80% of my caseload in some way, shape, or form identifies as part of the LGBTQ plus community.
During the summer of 2020, 1 in 4 young people reported they'd contemplated suicide, and 40% of LGBT plus youth considered taking their own lives in 2020 as well.
You know, I have a lot of youth who live with families that they're either not out to or families who are maybe not supportive. COVID really has limited access to medical and mental health care in a lot of ways. You know, some of my trans youth, for example, have had appointments for hormones canceled or pushed back because of medical facilities not wanting to take on procedures or appointments that are not quote unquote essential.
Dr. Mulder says checking in could save a life.
One of the most important myths about suicide that we need to break is this idea that talking about it raises risk for it. That is not true, and there is an abundance of research that supports that.
We met with Kate Pimmel of Glisson, Huntsville. As a mother of high school age kids, she sees the struggles firsthand.
A lot of us are worrying about how to properly parent our kids through a situation like this, and a lot of us aren't sure.
Glisson helps school administrators and teachers provide an inclusive and safe environment for students who identify as LGBT+. Though school looks a lot different these days, we're told students are still facing the same issues.
Negative remarks, not seeing positive representations of themselves, or not seeing themselves reflected either in the media or in their curriculum at school.
Glisson has taken support groups and training online during the pandemic. For a list of LGBT+ resources, head on over to RocketCityNow.com. With your Mental Health Monday, I'm Sydney Stallworth, WZDX News.